Well, good evening. Welcome to the second in our two-part webinar series on the potential restoration of wolves to Colorado, co-hosted by the Denver Zoo and the Center for Human Carnivore Coexistence at Colorado State University. My name is Kevin Crooks. I'm a professor in the Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at CSU. I'm also director of the Center for Human Carnivore Coexistence. Our mission is to develop approaches to minimize conflict between people and predators, including wolves if they're restored to Colorado. So we're excited about the webinars we've had over the last couple of weeks. Last week, we heard from Dr. Doug Smith about wolves in Yellowstone and lessons learned for Colorado. Tonight, we've convened a panel of leaders of the Global Indigenous Council to discuss their perspectives towards wolves. Now, before going further, I'd first like to read the land acknowledgement of Colorado State University. We acknowledge with respect that the land Colorado State University is on today is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples. This was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for numerous other Native tribes. We recognize the Indigenous peoples as original stewards of this land and all the relatives within it. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the ties nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed. Thank you. Well, with that, I'd now like to introduce our partner, Brian Acone, who's the Senior Vice President for Animal Care and Conservation at the Denver Zoo. Brian? Hey, Brian, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Thanks, Kevin, for the quick introduction there, and welcome everybody. We're excited here at Denver Zoo to co-host this webinar with our partners at CSU Center for Human Carnivore Coexistence. A little background for us is that here at Denver Zoo, our mission is inspiring communities to save wildlife for future generations. Inspiration comes from knowledge and experience. With the About initiative to reestablish wolves in front of us, there are many perspectives about wolves. And the viewpoint you'll be hearing about tonight is an important and unique perspective, and we are happy to be part of connecting you with that opportunity. So thanks to CSU, as well as our panelists from the Global Indigenous Council, and we certainly hope that you all enjoy and that you walk away with something that inspires you.
Well, thank you, Brian. So tonight we'd like you to be interactive, so please feel free to suggest questions in chat, and behind the scenes we'll be monitoring those and providing the questions to the panel moderator for discussion if there's time at the end. So without further ado, let me introduce Rain, who will be the moderator for tonight's discussion. Rain is Executive Director of the Global Indigenous Council and will moderate a panel of fellow GIC members, including Tom Roger, Nolan Yellow Kidney Sr., Letara Lebeau, and Ben Nuvamsa. So Rain is an acclaimed film director. His most recent documentary was Somebody's Daughter, which focuses on the human rights emergency of murdered and missing Indigenous women. Rain also advises politicians on Indigenous policy, and he was the initiator of the Grizzly Treaty, which was the most widely signed tribal treaty in history and inspiration to the Tribal Heritage and Grizzly Bear Protection Act. So I will turn it over to Rain, who will introduce the panelists and run the proceedings from here. Rain?
Thank you, Kevin. Paveshve, Devlesa Albian, Náhkȯxho'óxeóó'ėstse, Natsista, Nahom, Niaesh, Hestala. So I'm greeting you all, and in those two languages, the Cheyenne language and the Homani language. I was saying that the spirit and the creator brought us all together. So I'm joined by several of my colleagues from the Global Indigenous Council here. Ben Nuvamsa, Senior Director of the Global Indigenous Council. Letara Lebeau, who is our chairperson of the General Council. Nolan Yellow Kidney Sr., who is one of our spiritual advisors. And Tom Rogers, who is the president of the Global Indigenous Council. As I bring each of these participants into our discussion, I'll tell you a little bit more about them. We're fairly conscious of our time limitations here today, so we'll kind of jump right into the discussion. I think it's very important that the Indigenous perspective is heard within this issue. And far too often, Indigenous peoples are left on the sidelines when decisions such as this are being made. So I want to share with you initially an insight, which is a narrative from, and it comes from ancestral people from whom the Cheyennes, the Sutta, the Arapaho, the Blackfeet, the Náhkȯxho'óxeóó'ėstse, the Siksika, Gainai, and so forth came from. It is told the wolves were the first beings to pity us upon our emergence to the surface of the earth. One ancient time, the people were starving. And so families began to separate to go out and find food. The wolves encountered one of these families and they saw what a desperate state that they were in. And so the wolves between themselves decided that if they showed themselves to this family who was starving in their actual physical form, it would frighten these human beings. So what they did is that they shapeshifted in the form of young men. Well, when they did that, they took meat to this family that was starving and began a relationship between the people and the wolf in the ancient time. So the wolves taught the people how to hunt. And one of the first lessons they taught them is that when you go out to hunt, it is good to take those that have hoofs and horns, but those that have horns and claws, you must not hunt. You must not kill. They should be left alone. The wolves taught the people about balance and respect through hunting, because they said that if one gives its life to sustain you and sustain your people, you have responsibility. What they were teaching with that is that you have to be selfless. So when the people were successful in their hunts, they learned that the first one that they called to is the wolf, and then they would call to the coyote, then they would call to the eagle, and they would call to the ravens and other birds. They were demonstrating selflessness, and that cooperation was essential, which was one of the lessons that the wolves taught them. These wolves, they disappeared in the springtime, but the people, when they looked up into the heavens, into the night sky, they saw the Milky Way, and they called the Milky Way the Wolf Trail, so that they would always be reminded of these lessons, these values that the wolf had taught them. From then on, the ancestral people, they observed the wolf, the way that the wolf lived in that pack structure, to be highly influential and foundational to the sociological structures of the tribes. And it was everything from the requirement and responsibility to sustain all, even those that were weak and that were sickly, all the way through to how everybody participated. These were shared in the ancient time by the wolf to the people. So the wolf has a foundational place in Indigenous cultures, several of whom have connections to Colorado and consider what is now Colorado to be their ancestral homelands. Now, it would appear that the opponents of this wolf reintroduction measure have historical amnesia and ignore the fact that multiple tribal nations consider this land now called Colorado to be their homelands. And they forget that tribal nations such as the Cheyenne and the Arapaho were actually ethnically cleansed from this territory. So that's an insight into the significance of the wolf and an ancient connectivity to the wolf for peoples who come from an Algonquin tradition. And I want to bring in my brother, Ben Nuvamsa. Ben, Senior Director of Global Indigenous Council. He's a former chairman of the Hopi tribe. He's an elder of the Bear Clan. So Ben, I would like to ask you if you could share with the people from the Hopi tradition, the significance of this landscape, particularly Mesa Verde, which I think, most people recognize as one of the most ancient indigenous sites in what is now Colorado. And if you could speak the significance of the wolf in that context.
Thank you. I'd be glad to. Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Nuvamsa. I am a member of the Hopi tribe and former chairman of my tribe. I grew up in a very traditional household, and we all learn that nature is a critical element of who we are. You all know about the Mesa Verde National Park. That is a place we call Náhkȯxho'óxeóó'ėstse, meaning that is a place where there's song, where there's and the sounds of that come back to you in a form of echoes. But it was named appropriately because the sound was actually the echoes and the songs was actually coming from the wolf, from its howling. It comes back as echoes. And that's why we Hopi call that Náhkȯxho'óxeóó'ėstse. Our belief is that everything is connected. All the wildlife, they have an equal place on this earth with us, mankind. And so everything is connected. Every element of the ecology is connected. And if you replace one element of that circle of life, then things go out of balance. And that is our holistic way of thinking as Hopi people. Other native tribes have the same belief that everything is a circle of life. And so, that is why we respect every living thing. The wolf, he has a rightful place here in our ecology. Removing him, or even a small bee, removing them throws off the whole ecological balance. And that's why they have a respectful place, and that's why we respect them. In our prayers, in our songs, we include them. And when we say our prayers, we talked about the four-leggeds and everyone else, and how they would be taken care of and prosper. And so in that way, that's really where I am coming from. And the other thing I really want to say too is we have, as human beings, we have a duty that we have entered into a covenant with the Creator, with our caretaker of this world. We call the Masa, to take care of the land, to take care of all the wildlife, all the plant life. And so this is really where Native American people come from. And we respect, we revere the wolf and every living species, the plant life as well. And so that is really what I came to share with you all. It's all up to us to do our part in preserving that and that balance of life, the ecological balance. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ben. Nolan, I wonder if you could expound a little bit on the circle of life and the integral nature of all species in that, and maybe also speak a little bit about when the wolf was reintroduced to Yellowstone.
Oh, hi, my name's Nolan Yellow Kidney. My father was John Buster Yellow Kidney. Some of you may have met him, maybe not. I don't know. I was just thinking about that, what Rain spoke of, about the Yellowstone and the wolf being reintroduced to Yellowstone years ago. And like Ben spoke of, taking one component out of the whole picture kind of affects the whole thing. When they reintroduced the wolves, the beavers began to come back into the ecosystem more so than they were at that time, because the elk and the deer and all the other plant-eating animals were beginning to eat the food that the beavers ate throughout the winter time. They'd stash their food. So when they brought the wolves back in, it kept the elk moving, it kept the deer moving. They never stayed in one place and ate the food out of that given area. So the wolves kept the elk moving, the deer moving, and so the beavers had a chance to come back in, and the food began to grow. So they moved in, they began to put their little colonies together and build their dams, and then that brought in the other animals that counted on what the beavers were doing. The fish came in, the eagles came in because the fish were there. The other animals came in because they had a place to stay. The ducks, the geese, all that came in because there was water for them, and they were safe in the deeper water as opposed to the shallow water. So that all played a part, and I see that here at home as well. The wolves are coming in. A lot of people will oppose it because they keep the elk moving, like I spoke of. But there's a benefit to all of it, as well as there's a downside and an upside to everything that we do. Everything that happens, nothing happens the way we want it to, as for out in nature, the way Ben spoke of. But it happens for a reason, the way things are. I hope I answered your question.
Well, we're going to be going back to you soon, Nolan. So
Yeah.
there's going to be a lot to discuss here. I want to share with the people that the last time that I had a conversation with President Clinton, he brought up the wolf reintroduction to Yellowstone. And we were speaking within the context of the Trump administration's obsession with removing ESA protections from the grizzly bear, opening up trophy hunts, and then enabling the restrictions on land usage to be taken away so that extractive industry could move into Greater Yellowstone. And President Clinton was relaying to me just how involved he was in the wolf reintroduction to Yellowstone and how much heat that he took for that. I also want to remind people that the Lower Brule Sioux tribe played a big role in returning the wolf to Yellowstone. And I think this is an opportune moment to acknowledge that, elections have consequences. And if you can imagine how Indian country would be, how the environment would be, how impacts on climate change would have been if Congressman Rahul Grhalver had been Secretary of the Interior for 4 years instead of Zinke and Bernhardt. This is a very, very timely reminder to go out and vote. And if you do not go out and vote this time, you may not have another opportunity to go out to vote. So in terms of Colorado, I would just like to wish Cory Gardner goodbye. And my name is Rain, and I approve this message. So moving on, I want to introduce Letara Lebeau. And Terry has a prominent role in the state of Wyoming and on the Wind River Indian Reservation in the murdered and missing Indigenous women tragedy. She is the chairperson for the MMIW and MMIP task force in Wyoming. What I'd like to ask you about, Terry, is if you could share with the people how the return of the wolf to the Wind River Indian Reservation in 2003 really wasn't just about returning the ecological balance, it was also returning the spiritual balance amongst the people.
Yes, hello, my name is Letara Lebeau, and I am Náhkȯxho'óxeóó'ėstse. I am a lifelong resident of the Wind River Reservation, and I'd like to thank you for the invite and really being able to take a part of this webinar as far as talking about the restoration of the gray wolf into the Rocky Mountain region area. A lot of what I'd like to touch base on in a briefing is, the gray wolf stirs a debate, like a few other species of wildlife. Traditionally, in the tribal views, when we look upon wolves, we look at them as kin, as helpers, and on, the Eastern Shoshone tribal side and the Northern Arapaho side, we really view them as a strong representation of our brotherhood with our four-legged, you know, our relationship with our animal beings that we have here throughout the Rocky Mountain region. And myself living so close to the Wind River Mountain Range here on the Wind River Reservation, we really look at the wolves as deserving of respect, and you know, they're placed here by the Creator for a purpose. Some contemporary views see wolves as competitors or, you know, livestock killers and in other negative ways. Although, you know, the initial plan that was introduced back in the early 2000s that I had reviewed, you know, it really looks neutrally upon wolves in consideration and really consider them as wildlife species, you know, they're part of life, you know, they're part of our life here. And to be able to restore those to our you know, ecological system, it's something that we really try to look as something that we as humans really struggle to do, is just to really work with the lands, you know, and work with what we're given. And we really want to look at that coming into harmony. You know, that's one of the hardest things that humans have to learn to do, is to understand working with nature. That's something that's really vital as far as talking about restoration of the gray wolf into our Rocky Mountain region area. Rather than working against nature, we really try to encourage working in harmony with it. My dad was a game warden for quite some time here out in the Wind River Reservation area. And so understanding the migration paths and how the effect of the gray wolf really come into play, you know, the facts are the wolves really go after the weak and the sick in these migrations. And, you know, that's just the role they play here, you know, so creating that balance again and really learning to work in harmony with our animal beings and our four-legged, you know. And as far as, you know, the tensions that we hear about or the negative aspects that we tend to hear when people feel it's going to be controversial to reintroduce the gray wolf. You know, there's plenty of elk and deer for the hunters, and, you know, and the gray wolf when we all come together as far as creating balance. You know, and the facts are, you know, people have the potential to affect wolves by changing the wolf habitat as well through development and harvesting of big game. You know, and our approach is to balance the needs of both the people and the wolves. So, you know, wolves were really needing to be protected in a way, you know, because, like I said, they have a life too, and to restore it back into our ecological system here, we need to create that balance again, you know, as far as really bringing them almost to an extinction and creating that imbalance of our wildlife here, you know. It became a concern for me to really step in and, you know, become educated on this topic, and to also educate, you know, my locals as well in understanding how important it is to create that balance and that harmony within nature, you know. And I grew up as a rancher, you know, in the rancher's life, and really understanding the effect or impact the gray wolf has within our ecosystem. It's something that I really had to understand and really interpret for myself of how vital or how important the role could be to our ecosystem. So ranching for me growing up, well, it was really interesting to grow up in that manner, you know, because you're really growing up in, you know, I was a proud rancher growing up being raised by my father. Ranching is really living off the land and learning to, you know, you're working from the ground up. And that's something that we become humble, you know, in as far as learning to work within nature. So it's been really interesting as far as getting the information of that restoration of the gray wolf here and reintroducing it into the Wind River Reservation. And, you know, I grew up in Crowheart, Wyoming, half my life, and that's just a couple hours away from Yellowstone. And so I was really in support of that restoration when they brought the gray wolf back into the Yellowstone area as well to restore and help that ecosystem out there. So
I think it's really important that we put these issues of livestock conflict with the wolf into context. So in 2019, the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, which is not exactly known for their favor towards predators, stated that on the Wind River Indian Reservation, there was only one calf that was lost to a wolf livestock conflict. One calf. The Wyoming Game and Fish Department stated that in the entire state of Wyoming, there was 70 head of livestock lost in 2019 to wolf conflicts. And of course, over 30 wolves died because of those quote unquote conflicts. And so it's very important to keep that into perspective, because the way that people speak of this, opponents of the wolf, you would think that it was thousands and thousands of head of livestock. And, you know, Wyoming Game and Fish did make an important point. They said all of these livestock conflicts with wolves basically coincide with the season of open range grazing. And so, you know, there is an answer if you look at that these livestock conflicts are occurring when cattle are starting to be run, you know, into our sacred areas and into our mountains. And this is when the conflicts occur. So the answer to that would be, you know what, stop turning public lands into cattle pasture, and then you will reduce the conflicts. Tom, if you're there, I would love to bring you in here and ask if you could speak on the bigger picture, which really is the decimation of the biomass and how this issue impacts, you know, the climate crisis that we're facing right now.
Well, good evening, my brother Rain. Good to see you all the way across the
brother.
And ladies and gentlemen, and fellow Global Indigenous Council members, wonderful to see you're all healthy and smiling. That's very important at this time of our history. Rain, well, yeah, I just, you know, there's kind of on a much larger picture, there's about 7.6 billion people inhabiting the earth. And when you have that many individuals, large carnivores as it is, in search of protein, whether they be rich, whether they be poor, impoverished, that has an incredible impact on the land and the ecosystems. And you're seeing that worldwide now. You're seeing that, of course, is what happened when you have that much disruption of an ecosystem, and what you saw happened in California, where you have in excess of 40-some million people in an area inhabiting the coastal areas, the wildland interface, Oregon, Washington, the Gulf Coast. Look what's happening to Miami. Look what happened to Lake Charles in the last 2 months. 2 hurricanes within 10 miles of each other. One a category 2, one a category 4. And then, of course, the ultimate rape of our land is what's happened now with regard to China and Wuhan, China, and taking 10 million people, the size of New York City, and pushing up against the wildland interface there. And what happens then? We have bats. Bats from caves. We've disrupted their ecosystem. And when we disrupt their ecosystem, they find a new host. And who's their new host? Us. And that host gets on a plane in 2 or 3 hours and flies to San Francisco and Seattle and New York City. And then we have what we have. And if you go back and look at the coverage, go back and just research the coverage of the pandemic on January the 28th, the date of the infamous briefing of our president. And look at what the media was saying that time, that there was there's 100 deaths in China. Concern, but no need to panic yet. We don't know where it's going to lead to. It's almost, I immediately thought of Rod Serling. Somewhere between shadow and sunlight lies the 5th dimension. And that's what we're facing now. And that's, once again, it comes back to the ecosystem. Because when we we disrupt that interface, and we cage and hunt these animals. And never before in our world's history have we had such a large animal carnivore as we have now, in such abundance, and the taking of resources as us humans do now. Never. And that's what's happened now. And you see what's happened in the apex of the North America. Like I said, we are building homes. We are abrogating zoning ordinances, codes, and trying to build our residence just because we want to have that pristine environment, whether it means 30 miles outside of Denver or near Red Rocks, or in Northern California, or in Bozeman, Montana now. A huge article in the Washington Post today about how gorgeous Bozeman, Montana and Livingston, Montana is. And as you know, Rain, from our history, and Nolan, where we had to abrogate Glacier National Park because of the starvation winter and the smallpox epidemic. So we have a unique history of being the first hosts of genocide in North America, us Native Americans. Because Manifest Destiny, the greatest marketing fraud in US history, and let me say that one more time. The greatest marketing fraud in US history was Manifest Destiny. It was nothing more than a North American Lebensraum, living space for the Europeans. And that's now what with the wolf. And whether you be any type of, like I said, with the grizzly bear, we are invading their ecosystem, not the reverse. And you need to be mindful of that when you are purchasing that beautiful home in the middle of nowhere, or you're celebrating, like that Washington Post story talks about, how all these individuals from California, New York City, Chicago are now finding Montana to be their home and buying these beautiful cabins up inside the wilderness with no discussion of, well, what does that mean? Can the land support that? Should it support that? And once again, we're celebrating ourselves instead of singing the song of others, to kind of paraphrase Walt Whitman. So with that, I just wanted that overlay of context that we are literally devouring Mother Nature. There is no balance. And so Mother Nature is saying, okay, let me remind you of what balance should be about. Because all it started with were some bats in Western China who lost their hosts, who dropped their feces. Then they were eaten. And then the animals that ate those feces, we ate them. And how's that for irony and poetic justice? Now we will pay you back because you ignored what balance means. Thank you, Rain.
Thank you, Tom. I think when we're talking about balance, we also need to look at, you come from a ranching family, Terry comes from a ranching family, Nolan's got ranching history in his family too. But, people from the outside, when they're driving across, the western states and they see cattle out in a pasture, or they see cattle in a feedlot or whatever it is, very few of them are going to stop to think that these cows that they're looking at contribute and are contributing greatly to climate change, because they are like individual methane bombs. And so, we also need to retain our perspective on that. And it comes down to balance. There's a place for cattle. There's a place for ranching. But there's also a place for all of these natural beings. And there's a place for our traditional homelands not to be made cattle pasture. And I think, Nolan, if you could join in here, you made an excellent point when you and I were discussing this one time, and you were speaking as to how, ranchers probably have never thought that if a wolf takes a cow, the wolf may actually be responding to those four-legged ones the same way as they respond to an elk herd in protecting that elk herd from disease.
Yeah, I thought about that when I used to watch different animals, the way they interacted with what we would call our cattle, our horses, our cows, sheep, whatever it might be. We like to think that we take good care of our cattle, our cows, our horses. We give them their shots, all their stuff that they might need to help them grow. It's a money game. You're raising the biggest, fattest cow you can get your hands on, so you'll get the best price at the market. But there might be stuff going on inside of that cow that we don't know about, and the wolves will sense it, smell it, maybe. So they're gonna go after the sickest one in the herd, just natural selection, and they'll take this cow out. And the rancher himself doesn't see his cow as a sick cow. He sees that wolf taking money out of his wallet. So maybe they need to look at the big picture in that aspect and realize that their animals are also a part of the food chain, just like we are. Like what the gentleman before me spoke of, how people move out into the wilderness. They think they're having a nice private home out there, but they're putting it right in the middle of the houses of the animals. When I used to bring out people into camps up in Mitten Lake area, different places like that, I would, before we ever got out of their cars, got out of there, however they got there, I'd have like a briefing that evening with everybody, and I would remind them, you're no longer in control of what happens to you out here. By stepping out here where we are, you're putting yourself into the food chain. A wolf might get you, a bear might get you, whatever the case may be, but you're no longer on top of things like you like to think you are. And it's like we spoke about before in the past, Rain, how our people have that inverted triangle in our artwork. The people are on the bottom, the animals are above us. We understood that they were better than we are, they were smarter than we are. Even now in this day, you don't see animals going out having jobs to pay their bills. They're taking care of themselves. They're doing their own work to take care of themselves. In the past, our native people, we didn't depend on electricity and all that stuff like we do now. If I was to go move out into a teepee out in the middle of nowhere, everybody would say, oh man, that guy's just pitiful. He's out there living without electricity. He don't even have a TV or nothing. Maybe that's the way I want to be. Maybe I want to go back to the way things used to be, just around my own little circle. So these guys that are raising all their cows and stuff like that, we had a lion, wolf, and bear conference up in Polbridge, Montana. I told everybody at the camp that I was more comfortable speaking inside of my sweat where everybody's equal, as opposed to speaking off of a podium where I'm above everybody. So I told them, everybody that wants to hear what I have to say, my sweat's right down there. It's big enough to hold as many as we need. And that's where I'm going to give my talk. And I walked down, we finished building our fire. We went into the sweat, and we filled it with people that were interested in what needed to be said inside of there. And I explained to them, while we're inside of this sweat, we're all just people. Some of them were judges, some of them were lawyers, some of them were wildlife advocates, whatever. I made it clear to them that inside of here, you're just a person. Your opinion counts, but you're just a person. And we're all on an equal basis inside of there. That's all I got. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nolan. This brings to mind a narrative that my uncle, Don Shoulderblade, told me. And like Nolan, he's a Sundance leader. And this narrative is related to the Sand Creek Massacre. It involves two women. One was called Two She-Wolf, and the other one was called Stands in Different Places Woman. So if you can imagine the night of November 29th of 1864, it was bitterly cold. blood was coagulating on the maimed and mutilated and slaughtered along the creek bed, which is now known as Sand Creek in southeastern Colorado. Amongst the dead and the dying, was the husband that stands in different places woman. And her sister, two she-wolf, the two children, one was 6 and one was 10. They were finding their way almost by touch. Imagine this, you're having to go through the maimed and mutilated bodies of your relatives. They were looking for stands in different places. Husband, they found him and he was dying. And he said to them, "Save yourselves." He said, "Leave me here because I will be passing soon." And so they did, and they left. All they had was the clothes on the back, and one had a knife and the other one had a camp axe. And they decided they would try and find their way to the Smoky Hill River country, which was to the north and the east of where they were. And they were just totally disoriented. And after a week, they were surviving on what they could, eating roseberries. They took to digging burrows, in the dry riverbanks. And one night, when they were in one of those burrows that they dug, they were stands in different places woman. She was startled because she felt the presence of something close to them, but she didn't have the energy to get up and see what it was. Well, in the morning, when the light started to filter into the burrow and she looked up and she saw there was a big wolf, big gray wolf, and it was this wolf that had curled up in the entrance of their burrow. Well, the two women and the two little children, they left the burrow and they set off walking again, and that wolf, he followed them. They did not go very far and they had to keep stopping because they were exhausted, malnourished. And so stands in different places woman, she turned to the wolf and she said, "Hotne, wolf." She said, "Help us, for we are starving." And so the wolf, he looked at them and he took off. Short time later, he came back. He had blood around his muzzle. And he stood and he very deliberately turned his head. And they looked in the direction of where he was pointing with his head. And then he set off walking and they followed him. They went down into a drawer and they found a buffalo. Around this buffalo, there were other wolves from this pack. The wolves sat back while the two women butchered some meat. And this was the first blessing that this wolf provided to them. And this is a very long narrative, so I don't have the time to go into it all, but suffice it to say, this wolf took them through many, many difficulties. One evening, they had a feeling that they could hear something that was coming towards them. They didn't know whether it was people, whether it was men on horseback, or what it was. And the wolves, they gathered together and they ran to that danger, and whatever it was, they scared it away. Ultimately, this wolf, he stands in different places, woman and two she-wolf and their two children, to a place that the Cheyennes know as the Bunch of Timbers, which is near where Sharon Springs, Kansas is today on the Smoky Hill River. This is where the dog soldiers had been camped when the Sand Creek Massacre occurred to the south, way to the south of where they were. The dog soldiers had left food in parfleches for those survivors because they learned of the slaughter there. So they were sustained once more, and in the end, stands in different places woman said to the wolf, "Hotne, can you take us to our people?" And so the wolf, he continued on to the north and the east, and the women, he ran up that rise and he just sat. The women and children followed the wolf. And when they looked down, they could see the dog soldiers' village. So the two women led the children down into the village. It was the village of Graybeard, who at the time was the leader of the dog soldiers. The women relayed to Graybeard what had happened. And Graybeard said to them, "You need to go and thank the wolf." And they gathered food from people in the village, took it up to the wolf, and stands in different places. Woman said to the wolf, "Wolf, Hortne, you have saved us. We bring you this as thanks. Now you can go back to your own kin and look after them." Now that is history. All of those people that I mentioned, those women, they lived up into the 1900s. You know, Graybeard, unfortunately, did not. And so that speaks to the relationship that Nolan was alluding to in that. Now, Terry, I'd like to bring you in here because as an Arapaho woman, I'd like to know how you feel when you consider that the voices of the Arapahos and the Cheyennes have been silenced in this territory called Colorado since the Sand Creek Massacre, and what it would mean to you personally that through the return of the wolf, you're going to have a voice in deciding what's happening, not only with the wolf, but in our traditional territory there for the first time since 1864.
Well, you know, there are many, you know, such atrocities in the American West, and the slaughter at Sand Creek stands out because of the impact it had on the time and the way it had been remembered, especially for the sufferings of the women and children and the effect it really had on the life givers, you know, for our Arapaho people. And, you know, rather we lost and we discovered the Sand Creek, you know, it was really, I mean, just to tell the histories to my daughters and my children, having Arapaho blood, you know, within them, it's really impactful for me to take a step forward in my leadership roles, to really have a voice and take initiative in this restoration of the wolf, and how the wolf is really a part of our life and our ecosystem. And so it's a really humbling opportunity for me to be a part of this and having a voice. And you know, we talk about our homelands in Colorado, and we do have to really culture our children in the scenario of the Sand Creek, and how devastating it really was to our Native people and our communities. And to retell the story and the history of those atrocities, it's, you know, it's really effective to the cultural upbringing of my children, and how important it is to use our voice as a strengthening ability to stand our ground and withhold, you know, our integrity of what we need to retain for ourselves. And that's something that's really important within Indian country, and something our leadership individuals really need to take a step forward on and really hold strong to. You know, we really have to create direction for this younger generation, as far as how important it is to reassure ourselves of our history, backgrounds, and where we come from. That way we know where we're going and what direction we're sending our children in. You know, there's a few different stories. You know, I appreciate the story that you shared, Rain, telling it about the individuals and the women. You know, there was an Arapaho story that, you know, that tells of a young boy that was, you know, engrossed in playing and did not realize that his tribe was breaking camp, and he was accidentally left behind, you know, and then he wandered in the wrong direction. And as night fell, he began to cry, and a wolf appeared and told him not to be afraid, you know, and they would help him. And then 3 more wolves appeared, and they gathered brush and used flint to start a fire, and they raised that boy, you know. There was a story, you know, one of the elders had told us when we did the 2005, when the Wind River Reservation Wolf Management Plan was originated with the Eastern Shoshone tribe and the Northern Arapaho tribe. And my dad, being a Shoshone man of the Treaty tribe, that he, you know, the Shoshone word for wolf means big time, where, you know, they're very smart and observant. They listened well. And when wolves appeared in vision, You know, when they appeared in a vision, one was to follow that the wolf showed you, and the wolf was it was secretive and it was special, and it used to talk with people through telepathy at one time, they believed, you know, for the native people, and the wolves were helpers, you know. And as Nolan had mentioned, when you're plucking off the sick, you know, that's something that I had mentioned in there, was the wolves can sense that, you know, removing sickness, or they could be removing disease to really preserve those herds and helping out that ecosystem, you know. So that's, you know, one traditional story tells of wolves saving the Shoshone people during a bad winter, you know, by feeding them deer. You know, so the wolf was really such a part of our history, not only to create a balance in our ecosystem, but to create a balance, you know, spiritually. So to really have a say and a voice and an initiative in this leadership role that I partake with and within my community, it's a really humbling to be a part of it, and to be a, you know, a woman of voice, and, you know, reason to have an opportunity to be a part of this and play the role that I have been so far throughout my community, and just being a part of this wolf restoration initiative.
Thanks, Terry. Nolan, I wonder if you could. There we go. Hey, Nolan, I wonder if you could share with the people another aspect of spirituality in relationship to the wolf, when the wolf spirit visited you as a young boy.
This all took place when I was around 11 years old. My dad, he was a spiritual leader himself here on our reservation. He ran a lot of Sundance lodges and whatnot over the years. And me and my friends, we thought it was a pretty good idea to fast with all these older men. So we did. And the last day of the fast, we were all sitting in the sweat and kind of wishing things would hurry up and go along because we were all hungry. But we were sitting in there, and this spirit came in and it started singing a song to my dad. And my dad was talking into the spirit, and he would talk back to my dad. They were speaking to each other just like I'm talking to you. And when they got done talking, my dad called me by my Indian name. He says, this wolf spirit came in, and the song that he was singing, he's given it to you. At 11 years old, this wolf pitied me and gave me this song. And like Benjamin had spoke about, and Terry Lebeau had spoke about that, how they hunt. This song was used for when the wolves hunt. That's the song that they passed on to me. And they were told, I was told at that time that if I needed their help to sing this song, that they would come and they would give me their help. So up till to this day, I still use that song in the sweat. And when people come in and need help, I'll use that song to help these people. I've since given it to a few other of my helpers that come and help me take care of things here. But there's really a connection between myself and these wolves. Over the years of hunting myself out in the woods, I've had wolves come up and stand off in front of us, and they're not afraid of us. But it's almost as if they recognize who I am because of the song that I carry. So they'll stand there, they'll watch us for a while, and then they walk off. I've never ever felt threatened by them in any way at all. I'm always thankful to see them when I do. And I'm just really happy to spend this last hour with all of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Nolan. I think it's very important that we recognize our history and also our cultures and the way that we used to live as physical beings in a spiritual reality. Because if we do not know where we have been, we have no clue how we arrived here in the present, and we have absolutely no concept of where we're going to go in the future. With that, I'd just like to ask Ben if you can join us for some closing thoughts, Ben, because I think one of the key things for all Indigenous people is having Indigenous voices heard in so-called management plans. And one of the things that we advocate knowledge. And I wonder if you could speak to the importance of that very, very briefly before we close tonight.
Okay, thank you, Rain, and thank you everybody for bringing up the issues of how we go into an animal wildlife habitat and how we disrupt that. You spoke of expensive homes and ranching and so on. We did not talk about extractive industry, mining, and so on. And so we affect that critical habitat of that species. And that's why there is a thing called the Threatened and Endangered Species Act. And there's a reason for that, to preserve that endangered species. And so what that to me means to us is that we have to do our part to keep that species alive and restore it. And there comes the importance of a recovery plan, a management plan that has to be affected and be taken care of so that the species can continue to be there and continue to be involved in our circle of life. And so in that way, I come from my Hopi perspective that everything is connected. We pray for our four-leggeds so that they can be a part of us because they have a purpose. And that's why I got involved as when I was working for the federal government in a historic event where the White Mountain Apache tribe and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service entered into an MOU to bring in and reintroduce the Mexican gray wolf to the White Mountains, and also to put in plans for the Mexican spotted owl. And there is an agreement to work together to produce a recovery plan so that the species can thrive. I think something like that is possible for Colorado as well. But it's also part of our indigenous knowledge about respecting that life. Whether it's human life, whether it's wildlife, they have a reason for being here. The Creator put us here to live together in harmony. And that's why I'm going to say one word in Hopi that really means that. Let there be harmony, let there be peace, let everything be beautiful. And in that way, I say, by lol mani, yes, you ni, uyumi katsi na wukiawentuisni, sufkiawatsinome. And I said, let there be life, let there be harmony, and let's live together in harmony and with our children. And so with that, I say, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. I believe that's the perfect place to finish our conversation tonight. So I want to thank all of my colleagues here for joining us, and thank Kevin for the introduction. And so I'll hand it back to you, Kevin, to close.
Well, I didn't want it to end. So thank you so much. Brian and I would like to thank you all for such a thought-provoking and powerful discussion over the last hour. We really appreciate you taking the time to share these perspectives towards wolves. It's a perspective that needs to be heard. So it's just very much appreciated. Brian, do you have any concluding thoughts?
The same, very much thank you. It is a great perspective to share with everybody. Thank you to everybody who's attended the seminar as well. I hope that it was beneficial, and thanks to all the panelists for taking the time. It was very worth it and very enlightening.
So we would like to thank you all for attending out there. We'd like to remind you that within the next day or so, you should be receiving a follow-up survey from the Conservation Psychology Lab at CSU to ask you about your perspectives about the webinar. Please fill it out. It would be great to get your feedback on it. If you'd like to learn more scientific information about wolves, I encourage you to visit our website at the Center for Human Carnivore Coexistence. We've developed a detailed series of FAQs and information sheets on all things wolves. So if you Google wolves in CSU, you'll find that education information. So thanks again for Rain and the panelists, and thanks everyone for attending, and have a good evening.